You good?
Yep.
Okay, so without any further ado, I call upon the Leader of the Opposition to open the case on behalf of Opposition. Ben, over here. Right.
Mr. Speaker, our stance in opening opposition is that we believe we should have a norm in society where we embrace children and we embrace individuals, regardless of whether or not they make it hard for you to interact with them or hard for you to raise them. We believe that that should be the standard, and that when parents find it difficult to be able to raise children, that as they age, become mentally handicapped in difficult ways, the state has an obligation to step in and maybe take charge of that, maybe give them care, give them support in terms of resources to raise these children, support in terms of people that tell them these are the problems you might face with mentally handicapped kids as they age, or even homes that these children can go into as they age and become adults. We think this is a category of individuals that is small enough that it's relatively easy for the state to divert resources and establish very, very good care facilities and very good care systems to be able to allow these people to be treated by people that can care for them in a meaningful way that doesn't really hurt parents in the long term. That's our stance. We believe that the policy taken on by government is one that is very, very problematic. I'm going to talk about two things in constructive. First, how this policy will significantly reduce advocates for these kinds of mentally handicapped people and mentally handicapped people in general, and it disenfranchises them in a very, very serious way. And second, how we believe that the maturation of children, even when they're mentally handicapped, into adults, creates a source of value for parents that parents are really bad at estimating, and that parents are going to lose out on when they take this kind of action, and that's bad in the long term for parents as well. First, 5 points of rebuttal. They say that we give parents rights in order to treat kids and raise those kids because kids can't meaningfully consent and to the way that they understand the world, and we let them have some kind of versatility in how they raise kids. Fine, we do that. But the state steps in when there are significant harms done to those children that we think those children also don't meaningfully consent into, and when there are pernicious harms done to society as a consequence of implementing a bad norm, which we believe there are very, very clearly in this situation, so that's a non-issue in this round. They say that in the case of mentally handicapped people, they can't properly engage the world, and as a consequence, we need to step in and we need to make sure that they continue with their process of not engaging the world. 3 responses. First, how do you predict how a person meaningfully evolves in the long term because of a mental handicap, right? Our knowledge of how people psychologically develop in the long term is very, very vague, and oftentimes people change and can mature in ways that we don't expect. There are literally developments in terms of your cognitive function that are unpredictable but can make you gain some sense of cognition in the long term. So we think that you're probably depriving people who have meaningful ability to be autonomous of that ability without any reasonable basis for it. Second, it's much more likely that we find solutions and cures to mental handicaps, ways to enhance brain function in the long term, than it is to change a process that is functionally irreversible, stunting growth to the point that someone does not become a fully functional human being. As the government, you always err on the side of allowing individuals and society to make medical advancements in how people live their lives instead of stunting them and preventing them from becoming human beings like everyone else in the first place. And finally, who are parents to be able to deprive people of something as fundamental as human development, right? As the ability to become a meaningful person. This isn't just you don't get to have a religion that you might want later. This is you are not able to become the same kind of person that the huge, huge, huge majority of people around you becomes. And we think that there are a lot of things to come with becoming that kind of person and you lose out in their world. Finally, in rebuttal, I'll take back after this, they say that it's easier to deal with children and parents should be able to do that. But we don't believe that ease of care is a good basis for all parental things in terms of how they interact with children. We think that in China there was a practice where parents in large scale abort female babies because it's extraordinarily difficult for them to raise them and have them support them in terms of agriculture. We think that's problematic because it literally takes out a category of human beings. We also think that by their same reasoning, if you psychologically predict a child will be aggressive or a child will be socially difficult to deal with, you can also stunt their growth and make it easier for you to deal with them. So they literally would justify completely disenfranchising any category of people that you might be able to raise with difficulty in the long term. Yes.
Aside from naming things that aren't this policy, why is it that you deny parents the right to make decisions about the short-term future of their kid rather than saying, well, in 70 years a cure may or may not happen?
Okay, that is an extraordinarily superficial thing that you just said. This is not something that is really, really short-term and nonsense. This is something that impacts the ability of someone to mature as a human being, and this is something that's going to cause all the impacts I'm about to talk about, so get ready. First, let's talk about disenfranchisement and mentally handicapped. There are three things I'm going to spell out in very clear detail here. First, the lack of physical growth does not just mean you do not develop a big body. It means you lack the ability to develop any kind of meaningful cognitive and executive function. You can still have executive function, the ability to communicate, the ability to think in some kind of conscious way, while being severely mentally handicapped. The two are not fully mutually exclusive. What does that mean? Two things. First, it means that these individuals in the long term can't advocate for themselves in any kind of way and express their ability and express the experiences that they have to the rest of society. It's especially important for these individuals to be able to do that because their collectivization is what allows the rest of society to understand the kinds of mental and physical difficulties that they deal with. No one else can understand this other than the reference point of the people that are mentally handicapped, which means even if they're not fully cognition in the long term, we still want them to be cognition because otherwise you disenfranchise them. Second, their policy makes all handicapped people feel like they're basically a burden to society because the norm is if it is difficult for us to deal with you, we can physically stunt you and make you into a second class of citizens. That decreases not only their, like all mentally handicapped people's desire and ability to collectivize, it also decreases the ability, the incentive for the rest of society to advocate for their rights. So that's the first thing. Second under this point, they're not physically capable now of like the same accomplishments as other people. And I'm not talking about like Olympic medals or like Nobel Prizes. I mean like walking. I mean like walking, like literally being able to do things that adults do that kids can't in any kind of way, which means that you create a category of physically, viscerally second-class citizens. That's very problematic because it demotes them to a fundamentally subhuman level, which creates bad precedents in the long term, which is what Andrew's going to talk about. Third and finally, under this point, they're not acknowledged as capable human beings. We think this is fundamentally clear. You say that because someone is a burden to you, they should not have the same ability to actualize and develop as a human being like other individuals do in society. This means that they're viewed as a burden on society, which means other individuals are likely to view them as someone that they have to deal with, not someone that they have to treat as a human being, and they literally are physically children, so other people won't take them seriously when they try to collectivize and advocate for themselves, which means no advocacy in the long term. Finally, the value of maturing relationships. People are bad at estimating the value of relationships in the long term, predicting how they're going to evolve in a very, very human level. We think that even if it's difficult for you to raise a mentally handicapped child as they grow older, there's huge value in the ability for you to develop that relationship as they age, and you see them become a true human being. We think parents are really, really bad at estimating this, and we think the government has an obligation to step in and correct this informational asymmetry, because this is a huge source of value that parents literally cannot predict in any meaningful way, which means not only do they lose out, but for all the reasons we already identified, kids and society lose out as well. Crowds of folks.
Thanks to the Leader of the Opposition for his remarks, and I'll call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to continue to on behalf of the government bench. Hear, hear.
Two significant misconceptions from the opposition. The first is their understanding of mental illness. Mental illness isn't a radically evolving state of cognition. It is a permanent state in which you are unable to rationally process, caused by irreversible brain-damaging events like hypoxia, cerebral palsy, genetic factors. These are situations which do not progress. They do not get better over time. And we establish them as mental illnesses and permanently mentally handicapped people, classifying that as that based on this characteristic. So we think that characterization of hope isn't sufficient in this debate. The second is their arbitrary analysis about how we stunt their ability in order to engage with the world. These are people who don't engage with the world by the nature of their mental illness. They are unable to determine their physicality in relation to the world. That's what makes them irrational. That's what decreases their exposure. And second, they don't go out into the world because they're just unable to do so physically and interact with people. No, thank you. More than that, they hinge that idea of growth and interaction upon an idea of physicality being short, particularly being undesirable, that small people ought or have some inherent lesser value in that society. We think as much as social expectation can mold around that, people view and respect people with diseases who have dwarfism and cretinism because the nature of how we appreciate illness is changing and is subsumed into that concept of mental handicap. So let's look at their idea of advocacy, because they tell us that it decreases the chance for people to collectivize, right? It's better for collectivization when parents feel invested in their children and in the support that they're receiving from the state. When parents can collectivize when they believe that their child is no longer a significant burden to them and can make the time in order to do so. Secondly, there are significant lobby organizations which can take up the process of advocacy who do advocate for these as a charitable goal to protect handicapped people. And thirdly, we tell you that even if they're conceived as a burden in society because they're no longer, because society doesn't treat them as well by the stunting procedure, that's what these people feel on a daily basis by having this condition if they do. We don't make that worse, we just give them an opportunity to be less of a burden to their parents, to make it easier for their parents to care for them if that's the sense of burden that you want to appeal to. So what we're going to look at as well is like the nature of conception of illness. So they tell us that that the nature is that your experience of life is significantly diminished. And we tell you that you can still interact with society, you can still interact with your parents, and we make it easier for you to do that. They tell us we should then defer this sort of conception because we may receive a cure. That doesn't justify the short-term cost to these people and their families significantly waiting for potential hope. Dan gives you analysis that says we improve the lives of parents and children simply because parents can take care of them easier, less likely to neglect them, and are more likely to be emotionally invested in their child when they feel that they're not being overly burdened. They tell us that, well, oddly, they tell us then on parental responsibility that the state should do all it can in order to improve the lives of parents when caring for their children. This is one of the ways they are doing that. They're realizing the right for parents to take care of their child in a far easier manner. They tell us that the alternative for that is that we should put them into foster homes and mental care. We would prefer a situation where they remain with their parents who are emotionally invested in their developmental outcomes, in their care, who are more likely to be intimate with them and care for them in a meaningful sense, rather than in a clinical environment which is less regulated of institutionalized care. We give parents the ability to make that option if they, because the fact that they're not coping well isn't a barrier to caring for their child. So we create the situation where we enable parents to do what is best for the child, which is care for them individually, rather than deferring to allow the state in an inferior manner to care for them. We provide greater protection for these children.
Sir.
I'll take closing.
Okay, a non-neurotypical mental experience is not an illness, as your side says. It becomes an illness when you then impose physical disabilities on that individual because you think it would be easier in some way, because a parent shouldn't have to make their child develop like every other
That's
parent
not
does.
true. Mental illness is a defined condition that people can medically screen for and determine. Secondly, your experience of life is diminished, so even if that worsens the situation, that's fine. But we think what worsens your experience of life is not being cared for well, and we create that situation where you can be cared for well, where you can be emotionally invested in. Right. So what we'd say is that with parental protection, my positive matter is going to say why we should just prefer or defer to what is better for the parents, even at the cost for the child. Dan has already told you why the child's lives are significantly improved through the continuity of care that can be created. It's because, firstly, that these parents have never made the active choice in order to become burdened with a mentally ill child. Even if they create the situation where they have a child, the state continues to support people who do make that choice. This situation is one in which parents, through no fault of their own, are saddled with an immense burden, a burden on themselves emotionally and financially. That's why the state steps in to protect them. Moreover, on a second level, that these parents are the experiential actor in this debate. They're the ones who interact with society. How we can defer to their cognizance more readily than those who are mentally ill. We think that the state must err to protect this vulnerable actor who is significantly harmed by the fact that they are unable to take care of their child or immensely burdened by this process. These are the actors who have never made the active choice in order to become burdened by this. And we think we create the opportunity to reduce their burden while continuing to be emotionally invested and to realize their will for their child. So what we establish is that the nature of how the state ought to interact is to prefer the actor who is significantly harmed, one in which this after through the burden, through the emotional exhaustion, through the inability to care. And we think on the comparative between whether or not we're actively harming the child, which we don't think they are experientially, and they can still interact with society because social norms adapt to people who do have disabilities, it's that we should prefer the parents' harm because it's more tangible and more significant. These parents are the actor that the state ought to prefer and ought to protect. So we've established from opening government that this betters life for the child. The child who has diminished interaction with the world has the greatest potential for invested care from their parents rather than deferring to state organizations. Parents are less burdened, and we create the opportunity for us to have that continuity of care between parents and child. What we say is that diminished physicality isn't a significant harm, and that we can protect both children and their parents from the disability of mental illness, which is extremely difficult. Thank you.
Thanks to the Deputy Prime Minister for his remarks, and I'll call upon the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to continue the Opposition's case. Here.
It seems like they want to have a debate about taking people who are literally vegetables and removing, their ability to grow so that if they lash out, they're more easy to control. But they talk about cerebral palsy. That's something that I'm going to talk about too. There's a girl named Mallory Eagle who, went through elementary school with me. She had cerebral palsy to quite a severe degree, moved around in a wheelchair. Mallory was continuously ejected from class for acting out. She in no way held up to the same material that we were being taught, and yet our community put through, right? And made sure that she moved through the grades, right? Albeit under weakened pretenses and so on and so forth. Mallory is now a full-grown adult. She's on Facebook, we play Farmville occasionally, and she holds a job bagging groceries as a clerk. Mallory has been given an advantage and a level of dignity that is not possible to have on that side of the house, because even if there is a note of false dignity when people look at her and they treat her as someone who is not fully developed as an adult, it is very different from the lack of dignity and the lack of respect that she would have if she were in that store as a child permanently for her entire life. What does a 70-year-old child look like? What does a 70-year-old child feel like? These are things that they are denying on their side of the house. We are not talking about a simple debate where these people do not have agency and they do not have mental processes. I first want to talk about how much agency they actually might have and dispel this notion that just because they can't express themselves to us clearly, that they're somehow not capable of any interior mental life. Ilya tells you that growing is not just about getting taller physically, like the song said, right? It's about physical processes. It's about maturing through puberty. When we go through puberty, we don't just get pubic hair, right? The hormones that course through us change the function of our brain. They change our executive control function. The brain is not fully developed. We are not capable of selecting between two alternatives, between restraining ourselves. Mallory was less capable of acting out in those situations than she is as a full-grown adult. Therefore, we think it's, for one, controversial that she doesn't have rights that ought to be respected, that she doesn't have the same mental life that would make it absurd for us to say Alex, you're kind of a crabby person when you're older. It would have been just much nicer for the rest of us if we kept you small and innocent, right? So that we wouldn't all have our feelings hurt so badly. This is ridiculous, right? So if Mallory has that internal life, that's something that we think we have to protect, just like we would protect Alex's. But moreover, we tell you that we think that there's a weird situation where their agency may not be fully expressed by their parents, because their parents have so much physical control over them, so much control over their resources, especially in areas where there aren't the kinds of social structures that are willing to hold classes back and make special jobs and so on and so forth, right? In those situations, the parents are their only means to a good life, their only means to people that respect them. And so as a result, instead of improving those structures, the parents are allowed to coerce the kinds of decisions that the children make, decide for them effectively. Of course they go along with it, because this is the only source of good that they know in the world. We reject that, and we tell you we as a state have a responsibility to protect these kinds of people and to make sure that they live lives outside of this one single relationship that infantilizes them permanently. The next thing I want to talk about is an issue of rebuttal where they say parents are going to be more invested in their kids on our side of the house, and they're going to agitate for them collectively on their behalf. I think that one particular problem with their policy, I have three responses here, but one is that it's now on their side of the house okay to see your child as a burden. Okay to see yourself as shouldering a responsibility that you didn't have to, that you weren't random, you didn't do anything special to deserve this. This is right out of your mouth, right? That's, this is something that, unfortunate that's happened to you and you can do whatever you want. That changes the way you view your child and you interact with your child. The norm that we have is that, no, these people have intrinsic value and you ought to respect them. I think that results in better care for the child. I think that results in not denying them things that they genuinely want. Oh, you don't want to see that movie? Like, you don't want to go outside? You want to stay inside where it's nice and like do the preordained activity that I have for you. I think that meaningfully changes people's quality of life when they can't go after what they want. We don't see why these desires are like less valuable than any of our desires in the room. Secondly, we think as parents, see that it's okay to stunt their children in this particular way, it's okay to stunt them in other ways as well. Deny them access to information in the same way that like parents might deny their children access to education or any of these other things, right? We think that's a bad precedent to set in terms of depriving those kids of rights. We think that makes their kids' lives less good. Finally, we think that this life as a kid is something that's necessarily harmful because parents continue to see it as that relationship. They never give their full respect, right? If your 4-year-old says to you like, I don't like this, right? You're just like, fuck off, buddy. Like, you don't have real opinions, like, you don't matter, right? And when your, 40-year-old child looks exactly like that, it's very hard for you to respect them. We think it leads to a low quality of life. Yes, sometimes they lash out, they overpower you, you need to, control that or whatever. We don't think that's a harm that we have to fight at some level, but we think state resources are something that you can use to fight that.
To what extent do you believe that parents ought to have autonomy over their children? Because you characterize them as being excessively malicious and have no emotional investment in a child that's stunted.
So we think parents' autonomy over their children ends when they start hurting their children, right? You can force your kids to eat vegetables or go to school, but you can't beat your kid. Even though beating your kid might enforce in them some sort of punishment structure, make them really realize what they did was wrong. At the point when you're restricting their, when you're hurting them physically, we think that's something that you shouldn't be able to do. When you're restricting their development this way, not letting them go to school or something, we think that's a case where the state intervenes too, because it says you're denying them the ability to become a full human being. That's what the gov case is, that's what the op case is against. Okay. You say it's better for them to remain with their parents than go to the state. Again, right, we've got more respectful parents. We've got a state and a society that recognize these things as not responsibilities and burdens on parents. Sorry, as not burdens on parents, but responsibilities that they have to care for. And that's what I want to close with today. The notion of how this sets a bad precedent for other marginalized groups, those kids who are not themselves given this stunting procedure, otherwise marginalized groups in society. Because literally the narrative you have is that you've been given this burden at random. It's okay for you to alleviate this burden even if it hurts other people in the process. We don't think that's acceptable in this procedure. We think that in cases where you have an angry child and you give them a lobotomy, in fact, once a people we think that those are the kinds of procedures that we've universally outlawed because we think it's reprehensible to interfere with someone's mental life. We say yes, you might be a danger to society, but until you commit something that is dangerous, we don't have the right to cut out the part of your brain that makes you aggressive or whatever and have you walk around in a vegetative state. Yes, okay, your one life versus the 10 people you may have potentially killed, utilitarian calculus. That's bullshit, right? We don't do that. We don't think that's a good adjudication to make because we respect people's mental lives in this way, and I don't think it's fair to tamper with them. But mental life is not just executive control, right? It can also be aspects of your ability to reach things on tall shelves, or walk through doors, or be seen by cars when you're crossing the street. These are all things that we're denying to people, all things that are part of their mental as well as physical lives, and all things that we think they really ought to have. We think that, it'd be okay to neuter prisoners or take refugees and to systematically deprive them of rights as well. But the one category, the one example that I think really sticks is it says you can take your child who is mentally handicapped, maybe not to a degree as severe as the ones they're talking about, maybe not the vegetables that they want to talk about, but the rest of us, right, who are only slightly, and disrespect those people as well. Stunt them as well. Deny them access to education, deny them the ability to go out and socialize with people, permanently infantilize those kinds of people, because as parent, you can do what you want. We think you're systematically discriminating against this class of people, and the benefits that you're getting for it, we think are thank you.
And then to the Deputy of the Opposition for his remarks, and I'll call upon the member of government that is back after the debate.
Opening opposition have tried to obfuscate this debate with a series of crude analogies to things like child abuse. What we would tell you is that the difference between this and child abuse is twofold. One, we gave you a plausible justification for opening government, and we'll give you an even more plausible justification from closing government why this might in fact be good for the child. We don't understand why child rape would be. But secondly, what we tell you is these choices take place in a specific context. When you hit your kid, you often do so in a moment of anger. What these people are doing is going through lengthy psychological checks and making choices in full information, ensuring they have the interests of the child at heart. So we think that is exceptionally disanalogous. What we tell you is, government, we stand behind the principle that parents are best placed to make adjudications about the welfare of their kids. But moreover, what we tell you is it's not fair for the state to instrumentalise parents and tell them that they must bring up their kids in a particular way when that has hugely deleterious consequences to their quality of life and to that of the child. Three things in this speech. I'm first going to rebut their non-alternatives. I'm going to talk about how parents make choices, and finally I'm going to talk more about the kid. So, their non-alternative. Their first non-alternative was care. First thing we say is, look, insofar as care is an alternative, we suspect parents will plump for that. This isn't a particularly easy choice to make. We think if they can give the kid care, they probably will. But there are many reasons why in many jurisdictions it's not an alternative. Threefold indeed. One, few volunteers to look after these kids, in particular to act as foster parents, because it's a very hard thing to do. Secondly, few people who actually want to go into the careers where you learn the skills to look after these kids. We do need to be very specialised, precisely because of the demonising rhetoric and the huge difficulty of looking after many of these people. Thirdly, a lack of political capital generally. Recognise the fact that one, these groups are largely demonised, but secondly, they're just groups that don't get much of an airing in the political sphere, precisely because they make people feel very, very bad about their society and about humanity generally. These are the sorts of issues that don't get discussed and that the funding doesn't arise for. But insofar as it does, we think parents will plump for that. We think the only instance in which parents realistically want to do that is where there is no alternative, where they're stuck with living with a child that's a huge threat to them and their capacity to look after that child. We think it's criminal to deny those parents that opportunity. The next thing they say is, you decrease the marginal incentive to look after people, look after these children and give them better cures, etc., because there's an easy way out. To say that this is an easy way out is utterly monstrous. This is an incredibly challenging choice for a parent to make, and we think that parents, having made it, want to do all that they can to ensure that others don't have to. We think, moreover, other people on the disability spectrum, we're more than happy to advocate for trying to ensure cures to disability. We think your assumption this is in some sense an easy way out that decreases incentives in any substantive way is simply naive. The final thing they tell us is, but lobbying will go down because these people won't be able to lobby for themselves because they're infantilised. Usually the people who lobby for people who are very severely disabled, we're not talking about people who are slightly disabled, we're talking about people who are incredibly disabled, who have no capacity to function in the world independently, right? Those people, right, those people realistically don't lobby for themselves, or very, very few of them do. Realistically, it's their parents who do a lot of it, and in it's also other people on disability. We see no reason why those people would be less likely to do so. In fact, we think they might be more so. So, how do parents choose? Because what these guys say is, they give us a plausible justification for why in certain circumstances this might be a bad idea, like by talking about things like executive function and agency. We tell you that's true in some circumstances, but they give us no reason why parents are systematically incapable of making that adjudication. Because here's the thing, right? Leaving these kids is not value neutral. They may have to live absolutely appalling lives growing up, and they might have been much happier and much better off and much more fulfilled being infantilised. So the question then in this debate is, are parents going to make the right decision more often than they are not? And moreover, are they more likely to make the right decision than the state, which is making a blanket presumption based on some arbitrary reasons that you decide to list? We would suggest they are, for three reasons. One, they know the child, and they know its emotional construction. Two, they know its social context. And three, they know their own capacity to look after it, and the sorts of things they are realistically capable of doing. We would suggest, therefore, they are better able to distinguish between the cases where the factors that you are saying are more significant than the reasons we give for this being a good idea than you are, who are just simply making a presumption. Secondly, what we tell you is it's actually criminal to force these parents, right, to look after these kids under some circumstances. What we would tell you is that these kids can often be exceptionally violent and threaten the parents' ability to live a safe life. Moreover, looking after them can be economically emotionally incredibly degrading for the parents and tear them apart psychologically. Finally, it often requires a huge amount of labour that these parents have to engage in. We think you should present them with some reasonable alternative in environments where the state is failing to do so. We agree it would be nice if we could provide fantastic care for all of these people, but we can't, and in those circumstances, we think it's wrong to lock these parents into lives that they are incapable of supporting. So, 4 reasons why parents ought to be able to make this decision. 1, violence. 2, attitudes. 3, parental attitudes. 4thly, self-perception. Let's go. So, 1, violence. Recognise the fact that very often the justification for these, in the overwhelming majority of circumstances, this kid presents a colossal threat to me. Severe forms of autism, unfortunately, can lead to really dangerous spasmodic tendencies that can make parents feel threatened by their kid constantly. Recognise not just the threat of the actual physical threat, right? It's the perceived threat of physical threat that can constantly terrify these parents and make it impossible for them to form an emotional connection with their kids. We think they ought to be able to avoid that, and under certain circumstances, the only alternative for that is to infantilise them. Secondly, we talk about societal attitudes. 4 things to say here. here. The first off is, if you are a child, right, there are less expectations on you in terms of independence, right? If you grow up in their world, right, and become a fully fledged adult, you have constant juxtaposition between how you are as an adult and the expectations that come with adulthood, independence, and the fact that you are unable to live your life properly. Now, these guys say under some circumstances they might be able to live their life. Yes, the question and the debate is to what degree are parents able to distinguish between those, and we don't see why in an environment of full information about the kids individually and about the conditions more broadly, they are unable to do so, taking into account medical advice. So we think having to juxtapose, live with a juxtaposition of societal expectation, your own capacity is something that can be a living hell for these people when they reach adulthood in your world. Secondly, however, we say that these sorts of people are often held responsible for their actions in a way that's deeply unfair. Because they're adults, and adults are often perceived to be responsible, they're held responsible for their own failings in a way that is, again, intensely degrading. Thirdly, we tell you there's often greater fear as they grow older, and acts more of a threat to other people, and that's something that, again, people struggle to deal with, and a resentment that they struggle to manage. Right? Fourthly, however, we note that it's especially important for these people, because they're often people who get the least support from out, who need most reliant on societal support, because they're so dependent upon other people.
Certain things like social anxiety and phobias are also predictable early on and also carry forth a long time into the future. Are you okay with infantilizing people that have anxiety?
No, this is completely different. This is a total restriction of people's agency and capacity to live their lives. Insofar as those social anxieties are on the same scale as this, yes, perhaps we might be happy with that. We're talking about really severe cases, and you're trying to shift the goalpost in this debate to like mild autism like mine is simply not fair. Thirdly, we talk about parental attitudes. We tell you that parents have come to resent these children as being emblematic of their own failure. The fact that these people grow up act as more of a threat to their parents, and let the parents are less capable of looking after them, means the parents come to resent them as their own failure and their own inability to look after that kid. No, this isn't just something that affects them individually, it's something that they fail to do as a couple, which is why in many of these places you get very high rates of societal divorce. But moreover, the fear that the parent often has of the child, the fear of physical threat and the fear of emotional degradation, can often mean it's impossible to form a sort of emotional connection these kids so need in a world that often ignores them and often denigrates them. Finally, the self-perception of the child. One, when the child is expected to be an adult and expected to be independent and is unable to do so and held responsible for that failure, it can often give intensely negative perceptions about itself. These guys say they lose executive function, but they also lose the expectation of executive function, and the key thing is that their capacity to execute that is always going to be flawed in both worlds. We'd rather they weren't constantly confronted with that failure. But secondly, what we tell you is the very least the pleasures you look for in life are simply the ones that you're more likely to be able to achieve. Look, this isn't an easy choice, but we think it's a choice that in many instances people are legitimate in making very proud to propose.
Member of government remarks, and I'll call upon a member of the opposition to open closing opposition's case. Hear, hear.
First of all, this is a very difficult case. Both sides, there will be issues with parents and children, and it's not going to be a perfect, rosy world. And we understand that. But what we also understand is there are points where we have to draw lines about what the medical community is allowed to do and what parents are allowed to do to the integrity of another individual who's in fact not them, who's in their own person, and we preserve that right and the rights of individuals based on a humanistic framework, not based on other ones, based on predicated on ability and other things. So what Drew and I are going to bring to you is a few things. First of all, we're going to bring to you, like, as entirely new, like the actual framework to which we grant rights is not in alignment in any way with the way in which government is now choosing to give people specific rights, and we think that's a bad way to decide to give rights. Secondly, I'm going to talk about how the problem is there's an assumption of no harm to these children when you can't in fact know if there's any harm based on the ability of the child itself, the condition. And thirdly, I'm going to talk about how there's actually perversive incentives for parents to engage in these choices, which means they're not really thinking about the best interest of the child, thinking like about themselves, and why this undermines other alternatives. But first, just a couple points of explicit rebuttal. So, the government's case rests on the presumption that parents often have the best interests of the child in mind, and like they really care for these children. And I think largely that is true. I think parents really do have the best interests of their children at heart. The problem is that in these specific cases, they can't effectively communicate with their child about how that child will feel because of the disability disability they have is often a communication disability in itself. So the fact that they're saying, well, these parents obviously know how this would actually affect the child, they have no way of understanding that intimate knowledge that only the child can have, and we rather err the side of caution in those cases. Moreover, just this assumption that all these cases are like very clear cut. That we're talking about just extreme cases. Often cases are not like, oh, this is a very necessarily an extreme category. Like the spectrum is very blurred. Moreover, parents often have to tell doctors the symptoms of their child, so the parents could actually be exaggerating symptoms of their child to put them into the category that would allow them to get this procedure, because the parents would perceive that that would be easier for them, and in those instances, they're actually changing what the disorder the child is having and actually putting them in a really bad decision. No. Second point of rebuttal. I want to try to just point about violence that came out of the last speaker, because he's like, this puts parents under these violent threats. The problem is that's a reason for a parent to make this decision without considering that the voice of that child or like how that child is experienced. That is actually the problem, because it actually coerces parents into making decisions without taking into account that of the child. No, thank you. Okay, so that's like responding to the case. But like, Drew and I enter into this debate with the presumption that like we give rights to people not based on people's abilities or not based on the fact that like you were born like in a certain way. We don't give rights to people because they're like really good at like being intelligent, or they're exceedingly creative, or because you're born from a certain race or a certain gender. We prefer to give rights to people because they are human, not because they are in fact like have a disability or not, or they don't have a disability. In their world, you give rights to people based on like their intelligence or their ability to do other things. And when you have those lines, you create a situation and where like that framework is no longer allowed, and you may in fact like deny people rights for other reasons based on those cases. Moreover, we think this increases the stigma put on these individuals. Like you're saying that because they are not intelligent, because they experience the world in a different way, we don't necessarily think these people are like just permanently disabled. That's a bad label and reinforces that label on these people. They are permanently like that. We think no, they are humans who deserve these rights. I'll take you before I get to my next point.
So we agree with you that these cases are highly ambiguous. Given that, why, and we ask this, are you legitimate in siding with the most extreme view at one end, rather than allowing individuals who are familiar with the situation to make an adjudication one way or the other?
This is the point I'm getting to. These individuals, these parents, are not familiar with the biological feeling or the perception that these children are experiencing at the time, which is what I'm going to get into. So there's an assumption in this debate that these parents, that the procedure that's going to happen to the child is not going to harm the child. That is a false assumption. One, because this procedure is exceedingly invasive. Having hormones run through your system all the time is not something that's enjoyable to experience. And if that child is in fact experiencing pain, like you don't have an easy way of communicating that, or they can easily communicate with that to you. So that means they're in a position where they can't successfully advocate themselves. And if the whole government case is that this makes things better for children, they have no way of actually proving that. Moreover, because this is such an intimate way of, this basically stops, it debilitates the way people experience the world. So these children are maybe mentally feel as though they are an adult in their own way. And now you're putting them in this position where like they are still a child, and it's not like they don't know that. They can sense that. Perception, they still have to go through the world every day feeling as though they may be in the wrong body. Like, could you imagine going through your life feeling as though you're in the wrong body? The problem is they don't have a way to communicate that is going to happen to them, and that is the problematic thing, and you can't reverse it at that point. So we think it's bad to put people in a position where it's like you're literally destroying the way in which they relate to the world on the most intimate, pervasive level, which is the way you look, is how you look and how you feel. And we think because there is this harm that we can't account for, that they're always going to be like harming these children because they're putting them, the child, in this position where like they're seriously altering the type of experiences that they're having. Okay. So that's this assumption of no harm when there isn't in fact a harm. That's bad. Thirdly, like there's always a perverse incentive to do this. Like parents may choose to do this not because like they're like well interested in good parents. They may choose to do this because like there is like a perception that if like they don't do this, they are in fact making the wrong choice as a parent, because you are not opting in to something that is perceived to be easier. And we think that is a bad position for parents to be in. If they feel as though society is telling them that they have to make this choice, or like that you should in fact make your child like stay a child. And what that does is it puts parents who choose to like have their children grow up. So if that parent in the future has difficulty raising that child, it blames them for the difficulty they have raising that child because they didn't choose to engage in that procedure. That means that like the state or anyone else is going to be like, we don't think we should help you now because you should have just taken the child route to solving this problem. That means we don't focus on creating other types of solutions that could actually make this better, because this is like seen as maybe like an easy way out parents should have taken, but they in fact didn't. So because it harms children, and we don't think parents can actually make these choices, I think the state should intervene.
Thanks to the member of the opposition for remarks. I call upon the government whip to conclude the case on behalf of the government bench. Hear, hear.
First question, can these people lead meaningful lives? Opening opposition picked isolated examples where disabled people could hold down jobs, but there was a very, very limited psychological development in the cases that are talked about in this debate, where people are severely disabled, as in cases of severe autism. There's not much further that their psychological development will go. Realistically, the only thing that's happening is that they become a physical adult in a child's body, which means they're never actually aware that transition has happened. The only thing that happens is to the world around them, to the people that are forced to care for them, and that is the burden that's placed on them in this debate. Because the vast majority of these people have, in the end, the same cognition they start with, which is that of a toddler, which means they just cannot hold down jobs. So the point is that these mental disabilities are so severe. And the reason we know that is because closing opposition tell us when they say these parents have literally no way of communicating with their child. And that's the point. There's just no way you can have a dialogue in this instance. And that never changes as these kids come older. The point is then that infantilization in this debate happens on both sides. The only question really is whether these people are an adult in a child's skin or a child in a child's skin. We think that parents do still need to financially support them, but we think the best question then to ask ourselves is how best we can empower parents to do that, given that these kids will ultimately be psychologically the same. The only thing that's really changing is their physical attributes in these cases. We think it makes it much harder to manage them. So the second question is then, who is best placed to know what is going on in these cases? Michael gave you a pretty compelling argument to say that parents are better placed, given they know the children, they know the social context, and their own ability to look after those kids. That's not insignificant, right? If you as a parent know you're on the verge of a mental breakdown, we think it's legitimate for you to say no, actually, I can't cope with this. So we say, on the other hand, the only thing they're saying is that the state should just impose a blanket ban based on this generic distrust of parents. They don't substantiate this, but even to the extent that it might exist, there is an obvious check in this debate, which is doctors. If parents are lying about the symptoms of their kids as closing claim in this debate, doctors will say, well, that's not what's counted in this debate. You can't do that. We're only going to apply it to the most serious cases. But the best reading of their case, as we hear in opening opposition, is that parents have tendencies to be selfish and prioritise their welfare. Look, as Michael tells you, this is never an easy choice to make as a parent. Parents love their kids more than anything else in these cases. And it's just unfair to say that it's an easy choice. Or if in any cases, they're actually still going to care for these kids afterwards. They're not completely betraying them in these cases. They're still going to care for them. But ultimately, if you cannot cope as a parent, it may be reasonable for you to do that to avoid mental breakdown. It may be reasonable for you to prioritise your standard of living and your quality of life, given that you cannot otherwise care for these kids. So we think you're not actually in any way killing these kids. You're only denying them physical adulthood. But the point is they're not aware, right? The deceit and opening opposition cases, they're not aware that that physical adulthood has ever happened because they haven't developed that psychological cognition. So they're big in physical sense, but they don't aware they're not there. So they never feel out of place in those situations. They never feel that they're being denied that full actuation of their personality. So, the key question, therefore, we get to in this debate, given that we've shown that parents are the best place to know and that these kids realistically can't lead meaningful lives, then is the welfare of people in this debate. We conclusively win this. Because in terms of physical welfare, the point is that even if you disagree with the rights of parents to make decisions in these cases, it is just true that if you make it more onerous as a parent to care for your kid, it is more likely that parents cannot do so, that they will put those kids up for care. And Michael told you, that is the worst thing that can happen to these kids, given that care is underfunded, it's overstretched, you don't have the kind of support networks you need in the vast majority of cases. The key determinants of your welfare as a disabled child are you coming from a loving home? In other words, are there people around you who are willing to tolerate the difficulties and to see through those things, right? Because undoubtedly, as a disabled person, you can be very hard to live around. And moreover, the other determinant is, are you physically manageable? Are people able to give you that care? And on both of those things, we provide the better alternative on our side. Opening government state this because there is a potential for violence. Opening opposition tell you that you can just restrain them. But in the vast majority of cases, you actually can't. It's very hard to restrain kids, and they do actually scare parents. And it makes them, and the very threat of that makes them do that. Often the way these arise is over a miscommunication. You say to the kid that you want them to say, like, put down the knife, and you know, closing opposition will tell you how hard it is to communicate that. The kid says no and carry on waving it around. You feel threatened, so you try to restrain them, and they resist. That's typically what happens in these situations. It's incredibly hard to communicate. It escalates over very, very trivial situations. The point, therefore, is parents often feel forced to send those kids into care, right? They can't cope for them anymore, and they put them into situations, into orphanages and places that can't provide the care. Opening opposition seems that care is the future in this debate, in an unbrave new world, but it's unclear why this poorly funded overstretch could compete with a loving family home in which parents were empowered to take care of their kids and could physically do so. Opening.
So on both sides of the house, we have mental people in foster care, we have mental people out and about in our communities, and we have people upon whom this procedure has not been performed. Do you really think we get good care for them when the message we tell them as society is you are a burden and we can stunt you in as much as it makes our lives easier?
Look, unfortunately, the truth is these people are considered a burden either way. They are a burden, right? It's factually true that they require enormous support from family to even exist. It's not true that they can hold down jobs in the vast majority of cases. That isn't the correct representation of these people. They do require support, financial support, and other supports, and ultimately, they will be seen as a burden. So the question is, how best can we allow people to deal with that burden rather than denying it's a burden and then leading to this cognitive dissonance whereby people actually then blame them more for that. So in terms of attitudes, this is again crucial in this debate. There's two concepts here. One is public perceptions of disabled people, and the other is parental tolerance. Michael talks in terms of public perceptions by saying these people realistically never lead normal lives. They're people who are too disabled to do so, and so they're always going to be regarded as different to some extent. So then the question becomes, how can we foster tolerance and compassion towards these people? And the best way to do that was through actually in some way keeping them as a child, because the physical symptoms of childhood are so disarming, because it implies enormous innocence. You don't blame people when they're small, you just think, well, yeah, okay, fine, it's not your fault. But when people are older and they're acting out, you think, well, you should have just learned to control it. You should have sorted that out by now. People are far more tolerant of children. We think actually this preserves their innocence and this makes people more willing to help these people and assist them in what they do. But moreover, Michael talks about parental tolerance. He says one of the key problems in relationships, parental relationships, is actually that disabled kids are a burden. They actually lead to marital breakdown. For instance, the divorce rate amongst couples who have disabled kids is astronomically higher than for other couples. And one of the things that then happens is you come to resent that kid. You don't want to care for them, and you're not able to care for them, and that's far worse for the welfare of that kid. Everyone in this debate recognises the best thing for these kids was to be in loving homes. We were the side that made that most likely to happen. We were also the side that recognised who these kids were. For these reasons, we're very proud of our proposal.
Thanks to the government whip, and I'll call upon the opposition whip to conclude the case in the opposition bench, as well as the debate. Proper, here.
Mr. Speaker, quite frankly, I don't think that parents on the brink of a meltdown who are spending all of their time dealing with a 5-year-old who is ruining their life and causing them to lose their partner are in the best position to take a step back and really calmly assess whether or not they're going to make a choice that is the best for their child's entire life. I think instead they're likely to make a choice that is going to make it easier for themselves in the short term, and that allowing this kind of choice means that we're going to have people slipping through the cracks, we're going to be trapped inside of a body that is wrong. They may not have the same neurotypical experience that people who are not on sort of a spectrum like this have, but they still have a rich experience, and it's an experience that ought to be respected, not just denied to them completely. I'm going to crystallize this debate in two ways. First, I'm going to ask why a humanistic rights framework is better for the child, and why we preserve that on our side of the house. And second, I'll talk about how allowing these procedures stigmatizes these children and hurts our society as a whole. Before I do that, some points of rebuttal. First of all, on the government assertion up and down their bench that these people cannot live meaningful lives, that's like fucking absurd and offensive, right? Look at the fact of people, like the assumption that these people are just like nothing going on in their head is wrong. Right? We know this for a fact. If we look at people, no thank you, like Temple Grayson, who now has a PhD. When she was 5 years old, she couldn't talk because she didn't develop speech skills until she was 8 years old, because she is on the autism spectrum, right? She has written books describing how, as a child, she felt trapped because she couldn't communicate people, because no one else understood what it was like for her. It didn't mean there was nothing going on in her head. There was a hell of a lot going on in her head. But a parent who wasn't as understanding as her parents might have just said, my child is a vegetable, there's nothing going on there, let's just make it easier for me. That's wrong, it's assumption, and we would lose out on those people. Who, you say these people don't advocate for this. Temple Grayson has autism and is one of the biggest advocates for autism awareness and for campaigns for that. You would lose out on that, that would be bad. Second of all, these people have no communication. Again, they might not have communication at that time, but you can develop communication. It's very difficult to develop communication with a child who is autistic. It takes a lot of effort from the parent. It takes seriously looking for ways to try and develop that. You can look at the example of Owen Walken, who was a child who was just recently profiled in the New York Times. No, thank you. Who, the way his parents finally were able to break through their child was after 15 years they realized that Disney movies, their child was watching a lot of Disney movies, that they talked in quotes from Disney movies, their child would talk back to them. Their child literally couldn't talk unless it was in Disney quotes. The minds of these individuals and their personal experiences are so different that just allowing parents to self-selectively tell doctors what that experience is like and then make choices for their child that permanently affect them means that they're going to assume no communication at that time means no communication ever. No. Third, you have the idea that we're forcing parents to do this. Like they're just saying it's wrong to force parents. We're not forcing these parents to do it. They're ignoring the choice that we told them that if a parent feels like this is not something they can take on, the state ought to be there to do this. That is less likely to occur when you have the assumption that as a parent you could have just done this thing. We shouldn't have to take care of that child because you could have just made your child into like a little person and then cared for them for the rest of their life. Why should we invest money and resources into alternate systems that will care for these people as children and as adults if the parents could just do it anyways? You're the ones who are forcing parents into making a choice, forcing parents to ignore the fact that injecting their children with a shitload of hormones and ruining their personal experience might not be very good for them. No, thank you. All right, why is a humanistic rights framework better for that child? Because we tell you we prefer a framework that grants rights on the basis of human nature, on the assumption that because an individual's experience might not be the same as our experience, it doesn't mean their experience isn't theirs as a human, right? Note that the parent's relationship to that child is like one aspect of the rest of their life. Like it's just one dimension. Your relationship to your child, you also have a relationship to your spouse, to your job, whatever. From that child's perspective, their personal experience is their entire world and their entire dimension. You ignore all of that. You treat them as if they're not a human, as if they're just an object that you make choices for. When you say to that person, we know what's best for you and we're going to allow this to occur, right? And I'll take you in 1 second. We moreover note that this procedure is not as harm-free and we have no response whatsoever to the fact that this is a procedure that involves long-term injection of hormones, involves like doing things to a child that is likely to result in them later in their life feeling like they might possibly be trapped within that body. Opening.
So the comparative is that you opt for a situation in which you categorically say no, that this child would never opt for this choice if we could communicate with them. Your option is the state making a prescriptive claim. Why would we not defer to parents who Dan tells you has a greater emotional investment?
Because I just don't assume that just because you like birthed this child, you suddenly love them. Like a lot of parents, like the reason why postpartum incidences are so high among mothers is because you don't just automatically love a thing that came out of your body, right? You develop that love over time. It's much harder to develop that love when you have a child who can't reciprocate those feelings to you. It's much more likely that you're going to, as a parent, feel like this child is nothing but a burden to you, and thus you're just going to do the things that are going to eliminate those burdens. That leads us into the perverse incentives that parents have to want to make these harms occur for these children. That if you have this idea that parents can just do things, and they do these things to the children because it makes their lives easier for them, I believe it's far more likely you're going to have parents who will subjectively report the end of the spectrum that is not absolute and say, well, like you can't ask the child, the doctor can't say to the child, like, how autistic are you? How mentally disabled are you? They only can ask the parent because the parent is the only one who can report that. We tell that these parents are not like as perfect actors as they are, and in many cases, there are serious problems with the way they're making these decisions, we shouldn't incentivize those decisions. In the event that a child growing up feels like they would have been better infantilized, I just don't think that's true, because I think feeling like you're in constant pain, feeling like you are an adult with sexual feelings, but you don't look like a child, you look like Benjamin Button, is not a good way to go through your life, and I think many of these people probably regret that feeling this way in their life. No, thank you. Right? How does allowing these procedures moreover stigmatize these children in ways that we think are incredibly problematic? Because when we think that we infantilize the children, this side simply thinks that we're like making them children. That just solves the problem. Like, as he says in his last speech, they're basically children in their heads, and this just aligns them with like what they actually are. That's not true. And what we tell you is that instead this suggests that this is the only way to go about solving this problem. That because these people are children in their heads, we should just make them look like children in their bodies. This normalizes the idea in our society that that's what ought to be done with these people. If you're unable to express yourself, unable to communicate in the way that a neurotypical person would communicate, you are different, you are wrong, and we should do things to fix you as quickly as possible because, as opening thinks, it's just your mental illness, and that's problematic. We think that when you allow these things to happen, you stigmatize the actions of parents who don't want to do these kinds of procedures, who want to try and take the long-term approach and possibly later in the future have options for technological innovation, as our opening says, but also possibly take the long-term chance of developing communication with their child. Their child might not be the same as every other neurotypical member of society, but their child still might have meaningful relationships that that person can have. You stigmatize the services that are available to that person because the overall assumption is, why would you do that when you could just make it easier for yourself? And why would you allow this person to happen? From that child's perspective, they're going to go through life feeling like they're not normal, feeling like they're different, because they do understand, like at the point which they can like, pick up a knife, as you say, they're also like not the kind of person who doesn't recognize that they look fundamentally different from every single person around them. That child feels stigmatized themselves. That child feels like there's nothing around them that they can do. The services that we need to make it easier for those parents to raise those children are less likely to be occurring. The stigmatization of those children are more likely to be prevalent, and it means that these children are likely to live in a situation that's horrible for their short term, for their long term, for all these reasons. This procedure should not be allowed.